Hi everyone, I'm Dale Smith, aka Journo Dale, and we're here to talk about Canadian politics. It is time to take some of your questions, and we're going to start this week with David on the Patreon, who asks, can you review the internal and external audit status of the Bank of Canada regarding Pierre Poilievre's threat this week? So the Bank of Canada has external auditing firms which look at its balance sheet on a constant basis. And that's not what Poilievre is getting at. What he's looking for is the Auditor General to do a performance audit, which is a different thing entirely. He's not looking to see that their balance sheet is correct and that there's, nothing going missing. What he wants is this kind of more nebulous and judgment heavy, is this value for money? And what he wants it on is the quantitative easing that the Bank of Canada engaged in over the course of the pandemic. Because according to his flawed logic, they were printing money and that caused inflation. They weren't printing money. The money supply was stable the entire time. Quantitative easing is not printing money. It's settlement balances, which are technical terms for kind of fixed income that they're providing the same kind of banks and pension funds that hold bonds. It was just kind of a swap of bonds and these settlement balances. I mean, this stuff is all on the Bank of Canada's website. But essentially what Poilievre wants is the Auditor General to come in and say, they screwed up, they didn't think things through, their program went too far. He's looking for some kind of a value judgment on what the Bank of Canada did. And he thinks that the Auditor General can provide that because the Auditor General does that with a lot of government programs, which can be problematic in and of itself because a lot of value judgments are made, which sometimes the Auditor General does not get right. Nobody calls the Auditor General on that, however, because her status is venerated, particularly among journalists, so we don't question what she says. So this is what Poilievre is hoping would happen were he to form government, were he to put the Bank of Canada under the Auditor General's aegis, and task the Auditor General with doing this kind of an audit. Which is largely just another way of trying to attack the bank and its independence. This is nothing about the balance sheet of the Bank of Canada and presuming that something is off there, which is what the current audits already do. This is an explicitly political thing which he is hoping to capitalize on. Our next question is from Twitter, and Angus Bell asks, something I've been wondering lately, in the US, their judiciary is overtly political compared to ours. Often you see legislation blocked by the judiciary along political lines. Can our Supreme Court take similar actions regarding legislation? So just first of all, to kind of separate the terms, yes, the Supreme Court is political, but in Canada it is not partisan. In the US, it is a much more partisan body, in part because of the nomination process by which they go through and by which the Supreme Court also has particular jurisprudential lines around issues like abortion, where they are one side or the other is hoping to maintain a particular balance or overturn it, because that's kind of the polarized environment that they're in. In Canada, yes, our Supreme Court does overturn legislation, but usually it does so on the basis of a breach of a charter right, for example. And in many cases, the Supreme Court of Canada will say, yes, this existing law breaches charter rights, but we're going to give you a year in which to make a legislative change before we strike it down, so that there's not a vacuum in the law in the meantime. That's really not done on partisan lines in Canada. You can argue that it's political in a small p term, but it's not as overtly partisan as it would be in the US. And that's, I think, the thing we need to keep in mind. If you're interested in more of this, I would recommend Emmett McFarlane's book, Governing from the Bench. And he did a really in-depth look at the Supreme Court of Canada and its status as a political institution, even though it's not a partisan body. So yeah, definitely check that out if you get the chance. We got 2 questions from Jamie Nichols, aka Rose and Krantz, but I'm going to take the second one first. And that one is, why is QP largely scripted? Why are questions submitted in advance? It just ensures we get talking points. Does QP serve a viable purpose beyond sound bites anymore? So yes, QP is very scripted, but that's because message control has kind of become the dominant theme in Canadian politics. This has gotten bad, especially over the last 2 decades, partly because Stephen Harper realized that when he didn't have message control, he had bozo eruptions. In the 2004 election, for example, you had people like Cheryl Gallant talking about how terrible the gays were, and that helped sink Harper and the Conservatives in that particular election, even though Martin was not terribly popular and so on. So from that point on, message control and discipline became much more the modus operandi for Conservatives, and other parties started to follow suit. So you got a lot less, you didn't have MPs going and freewheeling in the media much like they used to be able to. As for that happening in QP, I mean, it kind of carried over, and being sure that message discipline was still being adhered to, so that you had a common message, whatever the theme of the day was. Contrary to the question, though, they don't typically submit questions in advance. What tends to happen is, yes, the opposition will have their lines of attack scripted, or they'll be assigned questions, and they will have to script their own. But oftentimes the House Leader's office or so on will have a hand in that. Whereas on the government side, you have people in the departments in the civil service looking at the media, what the issues of the day are, and preparing responses based on that. They get sent to the minister's office. That's why the ministers have huge briefing binders for QP, so that they have a response ready. This particular government is, I think, a little more willing to use good news talking points and bromides over particularly salient responses to questions, although the previous government also liked to simply deliver non sequiturs to questions. So in that particular case, that's kind of the way it's devolved to. Question period is ostensibly an accountability mechanism, and it's one that is supposed to be able to be responsive to the news cycle of the day. For example, in the UK, their Prime Minister's questions, which are only on Wednesdays, questions are submitted in advance to that, so that the Prime Minister's office can ensure to have a proper brief. But they actually have a debate culture and actually have some actual serious questions and debate and exchanges, and not just reciting talking points at one another, which we don't really do. And it's one of the reasons why when Trudeau takes all the questions on Wednesdays, he doesn't get them in advance like the UK Prime Minister does. So some days you'll get a reasonable response, and some days you'll just get a happy, clappy, good news bromide and call it an answer. So unfortunately, that's kind of the state things are at. And that has a lot to do with what they see as their messaging or their communication strategy. I don't necessarily like it, but that's unfortunately where we are right now. All right. And our last question, also from Jamie, was how is social media changing how politics are done and or perceived, and can it be countered? Should it? Is there less truth in politics now than in the past, or are they just better at lying, or were they better at lying in the past? It is a fairly broad question. My own observation is that social media has exacerbated the tendency to use your time in the House of Commons to transmit messages to your constituents. Once upon a time, you might get something in Hansard that would get quoted in your local newspaper, and then when the advent of TV media came in, they started using that to create clips for the TV news. That's one of the reasons why Question Period has started, in some cases alternates English and French on the same question so that you can get a clip in both languages. And it became less about a debate and more about a buffet of clips for news. With the advent of social media, that turned into, I am creating content for my social channels, and that is what my time in the House is about. And that's why things have gotten very repetitive, and why you have 6 or 8 or 10 MPs asking essentially the same question is because they're using that time to generate the clip that they can then push out over their social media. Again, I really don't like that, but that's kind of one of the influences that social media's had. And yeah, treating the House of Commons as just a content generator as opposed to meaningful debate and discussion. As for lying in politics, I don't know that I have enough institutional memory to know how prevalent or how well it was done in the past. I do know that in the last few years, in my particular observation, is that it's become much more shameless than it was a few years ago, so long as I've been on the Hill. And that, I think, is partly because you have a government that is less willing to push back on misinformation or disinformation. This government, when confronted with misinformation or disinformation, tends to simply use a good news talking point and something happy clappy or a bromide instead, rather than actually challenging what was being said. They do occasionally, call it out as petty partisan politics or something like that, but it's not actually saying this fact is wrong, here is the correct fact. They very rarely do that, and it allows the disinformation to stay. The media then goes and both sides it and says this side says this and this side says that, and you decide, rather than saying this side is lying and here's the correct fact. So that is another kind of contributing factor to how we've gotten to this place where we're at right now, which is really, really bad. But unfortunately, nobody seems to care enough to particularly call this out and particularly try and find a way of using their own communications to put a stop to it, because it doesn't fit into their strategy or something. And I think that's a problem, and it's one that's going to get worse unless we can get serious about calling the stuff out and dealing with it. And that's everything for this week. Thank you for all of your questions. Join us again next week for some more Canadian politics. I'm Dale Smith. That's at journo_Dale on Twitter. And don't forget to like the video, share, subscribe, and support us on Patreon. Thanks, everyone.